the president of Edge at Edge Connects, and I'm also a PTC board member. And we are so thankful for having all of you here for, as you heard from Bill, our record year. I think it's over 6,200 registered attendees so far. So thrilled to have every one of you. Thank you, and thanks for joining us for this really exciting session. Joining me on stage, I have some of our incredible leaders, both in digital infrastructure and in energy, where we're going to tackle one of the biggest challenges, as we heard earlier today. How will we achieve 170 gigawatts sustainably by 2030 to really clear the way for taking advantage of AI across all elements of our lives? So with me today, I have a fantastic group here. Why don't we start with some introductions? Bruno, would you give us a little bit of history of yourself and where you come from?
Sure. So I'm Bruno Berti. I'm with NTT Global Data Centers. I've been with NTT for a little over 12 years, and in dog years, that's 100. In data center industry, it feels like actually a couple of weeks. But I'm in charge of product and strategic sales at NTT. So I actually always tell people, I think I have the funnest job at NTT because I get to talk to customers, I get to talk to the market, I get to be at these sessions, meet a lot of people, kind of figure out what's really going on, and then work with our company to kind of build the right products, the right solutions, in the right locations, and hopefully at the right time. So it's good to be here.
Excellent. Well, I know you all are doing some exciting things that you'll talk to us about. They're leveraging AI and in all things you're building and doing. I'd love to welcome Jakob. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the exciting things you're doing over at Endeavour?
Sure. So Jakob Carnemark, I'm been in this wonderful industry since the early 90s. That makes me a grandfather. Hopefully about to be one on the other side. And I former founder, or I guess you never become a non-former, but founder of Aligned, and great company, great start there. And what I wanted to do in kind of the next chapter, back in 2019, things looked like they were about to start shifting. And so I wanted to set up Endeavour to heavily focus on the innovation that we felt as a team was going to need to be done around grid stability and kind of the emerging workloads that were happening. So the way Endeavour is structured is the majority, a little bit like an iceberg, the majority of Endeavour is the supply chain companies and innovation companies that we scale and in the platform. And then our edge platform is looks and feels like probably traditional co-location, but hopefully we feel we have a better mousetrap, or at least a good mousetrap. And that's the way we're structured. And it's been it's a wild ride out there, as we all know.
It is an incredible ride. Well, I'm looking forward to, we'll have you talk a little bit about some of the innovations I think you're leading with Endeavour, from waterless data centers all the way through to some exciting things with nuclear. So we'll touch on that in a little bit. And last but not least, Marc, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. My name is Marc Garner. I'm the Cloud and Service Provider segment at Schneider, segment president at Schneider Electric. So I've been with Schneider now for 20 years. Someone described me a veteran the other day of Schneider. I'm still a graduate in my mind, you know. So, but I've worked in different parts of the business, different areas of the globe. So across Europe and UK, and now based in the US. My role really is to develop the technology of the future, work with our customers to understand how we co-innovate together, develop the solutions that are needed for today and tomorrow. And really make sure that we are the partner of choice really for our customers going forward.
Excellent. Well, I know you've had an exciting year in 2025 with the acquisition of Endeavour, which is going to provide some incredible cooling innovation for us that we'll definitely touch on during the discussion.
Perfect.
Why don't we go ahead and get started? Jakob, maybe you can start us out. I know you have seen through Align, through Scansa, and your incredible background, though, the history, but also the looking forward in the future. With what we're seeing with energy and the demands to 170 gigawatts, what do you see over the next 3 to 5 years in terms of the energy landscape for AI data centers? How do you see that evolving over the next 3 to 5 years?
Well, I would say there's two main fronts on that. It's what's happening in the data center relative to the GPU providers and what they're driving. I'll kind of touch on the other side of it, which is the grid. And our team was early in the mindset of data centers have all this backup power and battery systems. Why aren't we making those grid interactive? And that's something that we've been on a journey as a team and are heavily focused on in Endeavour. And one of the things that we're working on is, to your point of whether it's 150 or 170, the answer is it's more than we have. Right. The way the grid is operated forever has this curve that's called the accumulative demand curve. It's all built around those peaks. Mm-hmm. Data centers have a huge opportunity to, as opposed to making the peak problem worse, to actually make the trough a better virtualization issue. So the hyperscalers basically invented efficiency and infrastructure around virtualization. There's a very significant opportunity to virtualize power infrastructure so that you're not adding to the peak, but you're increasing the efficiency of the trough. And so all of kind of the technology roadmaps that we have inside of Endeavour is focused on making data centers grid interactive, not making that an issue, and then also looking ahead to the future. One of the issues that we're going to have, and recently happened in Spain, and I think it's going to be an issue, is when we start to connect all these bouncing Bertis to the grid is going to experience resiliency issues for those that are not fully mitigating their workloads. Mm-hmm. And so what does a future grid look like, and how do you protect? And so the ideal data center of the future is, I thought there was going to be coffee in here, by the way, but now I'm going to use it as a prop.
We'll take care of that. With some coffee.
If these were our 4 data centers, there's nothing preventing. There's no technology, there's some stuff that needs to be done, but there's really nothing preventing us from, when the grid has an issue, for all of us data centers to coordinate and bring the frequency back up and or be disaggregated and aggregated. And that's something, when you look out on the landscape of just grid resiliency, grid security, the role of the data center, because we're not talking about 20 megawatt data centers anymore, we're talking about 2 gigawatt. We're talking about much larger loads than anything that exists. Right. So when you go put a 2 gigawatt load in the middle of a grid in the middle of nowhere, to me it's kind of unconscionable just to pretend that, oh, I'm just plugging into the grid. You need to think in a broader community sense, and you need to think about that asset being a stewardship of the resiliency of the grid, and that's our main focus in that. And I guess to summarize the point, I think that will allow us to not only solve and meet the demands, but create a more resilient grid as a byproduct.
I love your point on stewardship, right? That's changing our role, where we're not just a user of, but we are part of the communities we serve, part of the solution together and collaboratively. Maybe Bruno. Oh, go ahead, Marc. Yeah.
This idea of a grid asset is critical, though, going forward. That, you know, the way data centers have been built today, and what's been brought into it in terms of the renewable sources, the backup power generation, everything that's there, it is a grid asset rather than a grid detractor that's being talked about today. And changing that narrative is going to be critical. When you look at the energy consumption, we've tried to size it at Schneider in terms of how much power is actually being pulled from the grid globally versus other industry. Even with this additional 170 gigawatts going into 2030, we still think it's only going to be around about 5% of the total energy consumption being consumed by data centers. So it's a fairly small portion, but it's the fastest growing portion. So unless we build a grid interactive system that allows us to plug in, move power as is required based on peak load times, that's going to be a key part of how we change some of the narrative around the data center industry.
I think that's one of the things that I find, just even listening to the conversation going on in this panel, stuff we never talked about before, right? We always just talk about the data center, and I think in 2019, to Jakob's point, when we all saw the curve of the demand really changing and kind of, starting to hockey stick up, to use a Canadian analogy. I think one of the things that we all started to, how do we do this? Do we build more space? How do we change our design? And we were all still talking about the data center. I think the thing that's changed in the last 12 months, or maybe even longer for some others, is that power story, that power innovation, that ability to treat that data center and the way we get power to the data center, not just power inside the data center, that whole conversation is happening now, right? And it's not, it's not just rely on the grid or look at different ways of powering things. There's a partnership discussion that's happening now because the power piece of it is a key component to being able to do anything, right? That's got to come first. So now it's all about partnerships. It's all about getting different ways of partnering with the power suppliers, be it the grid, be it the utility, be it some alternate, self-generating type sources. We did the same thing. I never would have thought that NTT would have partnered with a utility provider in Japan as a joint venture partner in one of our developments. They actually are funding a data center development with us. Mm-hmm. That's happening obviously a lot more in the news, but that's some of the changing narrative that's happening with power as part of the supply chain before we even get the data centers off the ground.
Such a great point. And you have Constellation here in the US and the nuclear partnerships with Microsoft and Meta. Who would have thought, right? Again, same thing. Who would have thought that would have been so critical?
Get nuclear back up. Yeah.
Right. Or Google's acquisition, right? Yeah. Just in the last 4 weeks. So, Jakob, what is your thought there in terms of partnerships and the changing, I would say more like the changing role of partnering with utilities and data center providers and the like as we scale?
Yeah, I think it's a critical one. If you look at just what's happening with renewables, mm-hmm. right? We're getting more and more adoption of renewables, which is great, but renewables need stabilization assets. They need things that can control frequency. Spain, just before it went dark, was almost at 100% renewables. And by the way, I'm a huge fan of renewables, but to get to the point around nukes are steady state, mm-hmm. right? You don't start and stop even a SMR. And so to me, it's about a blend of resources, and the only way to work to achieve that is to integrate and work closely with the utilities on what are their needs from a standpoint of frequency control, what are their needs from a standpoint of baseload. So we are actively working across innovation on the SMR space. We have some SMR partnerships. We're mostly focused on improving the efficiency of the back-end cycle, mm-hmm. so that when you do have an SMR, kind of whatever agnostically it is, the heat that you're using to convert to energy, you get the highest conversion ratio. So we're doing a lot of innovation on that side. But the way, in kind of summary, to me, it's, again, back to the theme, I think data centers can perform a really unique space, either being, I don't think there is one answer, either a data center being nuclear-based, with base load, or a data center having fast responsive infrastructure so that you can adopt more renewables safely on the grid and maintain frequency, right? By definition, nuclear assets don't do a good job. They do a good job of sinking. They don't do a good job of controlling frequency. And so you need that mix. And that to me is kind of critical to maintaining resiliency.
It's the grid ecosystem is got to evolve from what it is today. One of the things that I see at the moment is there's a cultural difference between data centers and grid providers in terms of the speed in which they want to operate, the process that they go through, and that's one of the big challenges. That speed isn't transversal across this industry. We need to bring the grid operators up to a faster pace and be able to manage that infrastructure at the same pace that the data center operators are. And it's that ecosystem that we need to evolve and develop out to ensure that we're able to do everything that Jake's just talked about.
And that's just one other piece, right? I think if you look at sort of the utility companies and some of the news that's out there right now with, okay, this is our problem to solve, the data center's got to spend a burden of fixing and updating the grid and the infrastructure. I look at something Jakob said is that he's been in the industry since the 90s. The industry's been around since before the 90s even. And we've done a lot in sort of being able to understand power and distribute power and actually now even building large scale power systems and distribute them. I think there's got to be more of a partnership between data center providers at scale and the utility providers. So it's not like we just wait for them to pay them billions of dollars to give us power. I think we got to figure out the partnerships. And you said it, data center is an asset. I know that most of us participate in demand response type programs. A couple of years ago, we actually turned on our generators for 5 days in California when there was a heat wave going on and probably saved 40,000 homes across multiple locations from browning out. And I think that's the types of things that we can do because we build a pretty darn good product, a pretty resilient product that has redundancies built in. Let's leverage that redundancy and that capability to help the communities out. And I think there's more partnerships that we can do to make sure that not only the utility providers modernize, but that we work in partnership so that we can help them and they can help us and we can get the power we need to service our clients.
And some of that comes from the transparency as well. How do we share information in a better way that allows us to work out where we want to build data centers and how we interact with the grid in a more intelligent way from what we're doing today.
Yeah.
The grid is, in a lot of ways, needs intelligence built into it to be able to manage this interactivity that we're talking about.
Completely. Well, I think what I find interesting there is twofold you just said. One is the interaction, not just from data center to power company, but collaboratively between data center and data center provider, right? And the need to work and collaborate together in an environment, where we might have competitive, but that's been our industry, hasn't it, right? Since the beginning of time.
And we were talking about this backstage. Are we really competitors anymore?
Yeah.
There's not any one of us anymore that can service this industry alone, or that actually, one customer goes with, Edge, another customer is going to come with NTT. It's sort of, it's not as much a competitive environment. And you're right, there is some work we can do together to figure out how we can actually get to that 170 number. It is unfathomable, but the demand is there. We're seeing it.
Oh. Jakob, I'd love to change topics for a second. I know you are doing quite a bit in advanced nuclear and emerging energy sources. You have the Endeavour ship program and deep fission partnership underway. How do you see nuclear and SMRs playing into this as we look forward, fitting into the AI roadmap, and what advantages do you think that offers? Does that help us in any way solve the inferencing issue, which we haven't talked about yet, right? We'll talk about inference too. But what do you see there in steps to really drive also and accelerate adoption globally for that?
Like everything we look at in Endeavour is the data center industry is such a huge demand signal for infrastructure that one of the things we try to do is this is needed for data centers, but could it also be used for communities that are struggling with the same issues? So in the example of nuclear, we were looking for something that could be safe, I want to say low tech in the sense of highly replicable. So one of the interesting things that deep fission come upon is if you put them at a certain depth, the confinement pressure equals a lot of, cost of construction that goes away. The largest cost of nuclear and SMR is the containment and all the infrastructure around it. But there's many nuclear technologies that we're interested in. I definitely believe that SMRs will become a significant thing, but I don't believe that they're going to be, everywhere and replacing all things, because by definition, an SMR, and this is the core issue, is a stable base load unit. And we're talking about close coupling to a highly volatile workload. So there needs to be something in between. And that something in between to me is the key kind of focus area, because that can be a resiliency asset for the grid. It can be a resiliency for grid security. It can And so, yeah, SMRs will see, I've heard from many companies, and I hope it's true, it's right around the corner. But as we all know with nuclear, I don't think it's really an innovation issue, it's a regulation issue. It's, when the first one happens and it happens in the local community, like there's pushback in data centers in many communities today. We think we try hard to do a very good job of zero water and all the other things that we do to make them, stewards of communities and community assets. But we're going to have to wait and see how that plays out and where they get located. But I'm a huge believer in it and think that it'll be an important part of the mix.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, very, very similar. I think for us, it's not just one. I think Jakob said this, and I hate to sound like I'm repeating, but it isn't just one technology, right? If you look at sort of the scale at a global level, SMRs make sense in certain parts of the U.S. I think there's, fuel cell. I know Bloom's been around for quite a number of years. There's some other fuel cell technology with hydrogen and natural gas. Obviously, the turbine issue is the quick, or the natural gas turbines are the quick solution that we're seeing a lot in these gigafactories. I think it is going to be a combination of figuring out which sources and which technology is right given the location, given the legislation, given the jurisdictions of where those things are going to be. And I think it is a mix of all these solutions depending on the region. And I think one benefits of us with having that global scale, it benefits as well as a bit of an opportunity challenge, is that we have to look at them all. It can't just be one solution. And as of yet, I don't think there is one panacea that's going to get us everything we need. It really is going to be working with that combination of the different technologies and options that are out there.
Well, not just one solution, as you said, hybrid, but also the flexibility to deploy based on maybe workload type, so that whether it's bursty or continuous.
Yeah.
How do you see inference and the deployment of inference? What does that now do to where we're picking sites, what power sources we look? How does that change what we look at from an energy view and a site selection perspective?
I'll start. So we're starting to see that inference. Obviously, we're getting customers that are asking us for inference, and for us, that's really going to start. And what we're seeing, at least from my opinion, is that we're seeing the traditional data center markets and the secondary data center markets really starting to pick up demand again. Right? We're not just chasing power; they really need to be in the locations where those inference, those agentic solutions need to kind of be consistent. So we're seeing that demand. And I think one of the things that we're noticing as well is that that's not as bursty and that's not as, kind of cyclical in terms of the load profile. So we think that's going to help us with that power demand, that power kind of consistency that the grid likes and that actually the utility providers like, and that some of these alternate power solutions like as well. So we're seeing the inferences already here. We've already started deploying some of our clients with some inference solutions. They are bigger scale than we probably thought. I think last year I was saying 2 to 4. We're seeing customers asking 10, 16, 20 megawatts of capacity for their inference and agentic type solutions, which I think, again, is going to help us with the grid, because now we can predict that load and actually be very confident that we'll hit 80% of that load or 70%, whatever that number is. But that's going to be pretty critical for us being able to solve that power solution up front that we talked about.
For sure.
We were talking about this backstage. There's a lot of stranded power out there at the moment, and we've got to start taking a look at that in a slightly different way. There's restrictions that stop us from accessing it. The way the contracts are written today is one of those things that we should start to look at and deep dive into in a more thorough manner than what we're doing today. A lot of the inferencing for me is going to be fairly segment specific. You look at what healthcare is going to need in comparison to retail, it'll be a very different infrastructure that sits around that. And when we start to think about where the power is, the power dynamic starts to change a little bit depending on where that inferencing is going to sit and which market it's going to serve. I also think we've just got to take a look at how we're going to use the infrastructure that exists differently. Everyone's tried to get more people to go back to their offices. it's worked in some cases,
Right.
some cases not. But that means there's a lot of office space that isn't being used to its full capacity. There's power that's supporting that. Can we start to use that in a slightly different way? And I've seen some really interesting programs, particularly in Europe, with an idea around how they link it to EV charging, where they're putting power for the EV charging. Can they then link smaller distributed IT inferencing to that? So I think it's just reimagining a little bit around how we service the markets and what inferencing is going to look like. But I agree with yourself, Bruno, there that this is already happening today. It's already being deployed, and it's part of the demand that we're seeing.
Inference, obviously, by definition, is closer to eyeballs, closer to communities. There's a really significant opportunity for, like, for example, we're doing a project in Europe right now, and actually 3, where we're using 100% of the waste heat. So we designed the ThermalWorks chiller to output 140 degree F or 60 C, which basically is domestic. We can upgrade it for district heating. So we're doing multiple district heating products. I hope that that's something that becomes a thing in the US. We're trying to get that started here. But it's a great opportunity. There's, it's free heat. In most cases, more than you need. And so, if you look at inference, medical facilities, universities, R&D, the cost, if I'm using AI for drug discovery, I really want that co-located. And there's a huge opportunity of things like hospitals use tremendous amounts of hot water to solve all their hot water needs with co-located. And so that's a lot of our technology roadmap is dedicated to how do we make these assets connected, and it's better from an investment standpoint because you're getting more revenue from the same CapEx, but it's from a sustainability standpoint, it's a huge plus from sustainability side.
I think when you look at it, where it doesn't need to be co-located. I spent a fair amount of time in Europe before coming over here, and you build a data center in Oslo, it'll service almost all of the UK and a big portion of Europe at the latency levels that we needed to operate at. So ultimately, that big data center that you're going to build there becomes an inferencing site for a big part of Europe. It's just that where we need it close to the point of consumption, that's where I think there's going to be more challenges for us to go and deploy.
One of the things I think you just brought up, both of you, that I think is an interesting challenge we've always had is perspective of the communities that we're a part of, right? And how we want to shift perceptions from being a burden to a benefit. And then I think some of the examples you were sharing there, Jakob, how do you see, all 3 of you, how do you see our role? What are some things you're seeing we should be doing differently to help drive that shift in perception? Because I love what you're talking about in terms of helping a hospital figure out how they reduce waste, how they become more sustainable by very much being co-located in those communities to serve them. What are your thoughts? Let's start maybe right back with you.
So one of the things we wanted to do, and it was, I would say easy, but we did it early, was we don't want to use any water. So one of the biggest pushbacks is water. We wanted to solve for, there was always a trade-off between if we don't use water, we have less efficiency.
Right.
We wanted to solve that trade-off. We did. We're as efficient as the most efficient adiabatic systems. The next thing we turned our sight to is this whole aspect of power. It's come up in multiple data centers that we're working on. Is communities saying, well, what happens if the client, goes away from the lease or something happens or AI? Who's going to pay for this gigawatt of power? And it shouldn't be the local businesses and residents. And so in order for that not to happen, you need to think about the proper architecture back to that peak so that you're not you're adding infrastructure that's positive to better virtualization. And the thing that we're focused, I would say probably more so now with those behind us, is a gigawatt data center is a $10 billion project, right?
At least.
There's nothing preventing us from being a hub for economic activity in that region. So we're looking at areas for example, coal country, right? Great,
West Virginia.
unbelievably industrious resources there. Why can't we leverage some of that grid infrastructure, help them accelerate the transition to gas and carbon neutral, but look for opportunities to engage the community workforce, not just during the construction, but in a longer term impact? Because the workloads of all of the hyperscalers out there can literally solve some of these systemic, in transit. If you look at one of the largest coal plants that started to drone on, something I happen to be passionate about right now, you get 300 jobs. When you calculate the carbon footprint, I did it, 66,000 tons per year per person. That just doesn't make any sense. Like, let's go give that person a higher paying job.
Right.
So we like the motto now, which we've been out in the field on this, is 20% more jobs at 20% higher pay, and let's go create through the data center ecosystem and provide a shift there, which will be much longer lasting than just the construction jobs, right?
Right.
I think that's one of the things that I've been in the industry a while, and for the longest time, we've been the best kept secret in the world, right? Like I said this at a previous conference, but I used to go to a dinner party and someone would ask what you do, and I always dread that question. Work in the data center business, and they'd look at you funny, like, what the heck is that? But now it's like, everybody starts giving me their opinions of what I'm doing, and it's interesting. So I think the fact that we were so secretive for so long, and I think that kind of hub from the telecom beginnings, that nobody needed to know where the central office was, nobody needed to know where the data center was. Those days are gone. Like, we can't be secretive anymore, and I think us being secretive and not necessarily educating the customers or the communities and being a part of the communities soon enough has led to that false narrative, right? I think we all know the misinformation that's out there. I've heard it. I've actually had families of friends of my daughter saying, oh my God, you guys are wasting millions of gallons of water. And it's like, no, we don't. But it's like, I think the education has to be there. We really have to do our part in educating. We have to do our part in the community engagement. We gotta talk about what we do. Like, I'd love to get just raise a hands, how many people have actually been inside a data center, inside one of our clients' spaces? Like, to me, that's what's missing from the communities. Like, to me, every time I walk in, and I'm a geek, but every time I look at a rack that a customer's deployed, and I know what that rack is doing, whether it's learning what a car should be driving, or getting ready for a space launch, or getting ready for a tweet or something that's going to be sent out on the cloud. It amazes me to see that that's what that server is doing. And I don't think the communities understand the value of what the data centers are doing. And then to the opposite, the value of what we bring to the community. With the waste heat, we're doing the same in Berlin. There's thousands of homes and office buildings that are getting free heat based on what we're doing inside that data center. And we need to do a lot more of that and be part of the community and stop. I'll say it, stop being these ugly beige boxes that are undescript, right? Let's spend a few $1 million and make that building look nice. Put a park, put a nice little community around there. We can all do that. We need to do more of that.
I think, I look at this from one of the benefits of being kind of in Schneider. You get to see what's happening in all the other different industries as well around the world. I don't think there's any other industry that's done more from an efficiency point of view than what the data center industry is. Bruno and I were talking backstage around PUE and whether it should be a measure or not going forward. No. But if we use this as a measure, what the reductions over the last 10 years in terms of PUE, no other industry is reducing their energy consumption at the same kind of pace that the data center is. And we need to celebrate some of what we're doing in a different way from what we do today. I don't think any of the rest of the world sees all that work that's going on around simplification of how we deploy, how we drive efficiency in our operations day to day. So we need to make that more visible, and it's part of that communication path. The other thought that springs to mind, though, is if it's difficult to build a data center today, wait until we start putting a small nuclear reactor next to it as well. Right. It's going to be really difficult at that point.
Well, hence our need, right, of really being much more proactive. It's funny, though, if you look at the telecoms industry, they went through something quite similar and had to spend real focused effort in getting to know the communities that they're part of and that they serve and being involved. And as a good steward, this goes back to that stewardship concept you guys talked about. Yeah. I'm going to switch up a little bit. Let's talk about some of the geopolitical things, the excitement that's going on globally, right? All of you are global here. Maybe, Bruno, we'll start with you. How are you seeing, with NTT Global, right, on the data center side, how are you seeing some of those geopolitical challenges play out? How is that influencing where you're looking to invest and grow to support your clients? And then how are you managing it from a supply chain perspective?
I think the geopolitical thing is interesting because we are seeing demand in different locations based on that, right? We're seeing a lot of demand in Asia Pacific, specifically, in the Malaysia, and I think it was mentioned before in Indonesia, because of the demand profiles getting ready for some of the geopolitical, avoiding different countries and making sure that the connectivity is available to avoid certain areas. So we're seeing the demand kind of floating everywhere from that perspective. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty with design and sort of, do we go liquid cooling? Do we not do liquid cooling based on the chipsets that are going to be available in those different countries? So it is an interesting dilemma where we had this. I'm a product guy, so my focus is always, how do we standardize to build the same thing? And I think we're realizing that you can't necessarily do that in every single region, because there is going to be different technology, different chips, different IT equipment that's going to be deployed in those regions depending on what the customers are doing. So we are seeing that geopolitical influence really start to drive buying decisions and behavior. And regulatory pieces aside, I think the information is definitely changing to the point where you got to react and make different decisions in different regions.
Yeah. And Jakob, I imagine you're seeing quite a bit of that in some of your.
Yeah, we're pretty active now globally. We're moving into Africa, moving into Asia. We have significant growing presence in Europe and the U.S. And things that we're thinking about and kind of reacting to is third world or developing countries used to be defined by a lack of infrastructure. In other words, not good water, not good grid. I think there's a very growing realization as people start to use AI for research, for development, for education, for medicine, and dare I say it, its implications on military side. There's going to be pockets in the world of almost the equivalent of third world, right, in a lack of infrastructure. So I think most governments, and this is evident throughout Europe, is realizing the strategic necessity of having sovereign AI, which is driving a lot of the early projects there. They seem, especially in Europe, engagements seem to be more driven by that consciousness of the strategic importance of having sovereign local AI. And then the other thing that we're looking a lot at, and I believe in, is that as AI, everything is going to be more inference-centric, in other words, population-centric. As you start to move that infrastructure into developing countries, there's a huge opportunity to get it right. Let's not go build telephone poles, to the cellular analogy.
Right.
Let's go build infrastructure that is an asset for that community. So we're doing a lot around that. Everything from, we're working potentially, or early days on a project in Malaysia where it'll actually be fueled by plastic waste, which is a huge problem in Asia, right? And so things like that you can look at, regional issues and have the data center become a solution for them is something that I think there's a huge opportunity to do.
What opportunities, playing further on that, do you think exist for international collaboration for driving sustainability even further? You would imagine international collaboration as a critical element of that. How do you see that playing out and bridging, whether it be sovereign data and sovereign cloud, sovereign AI, but how do you find a way to bridge that for really solving sustainability on a global standpoint together?
Well, in Europe, as colleagues both are active there, it's a very, it's not even community pushback. You can't get to first base on the data center in Europe, at least most parts of Europe, unless you have a very, very significant sustainability community plan. And as he mentioned, and we're doing the same, is like we have a project, or 3 of them in Europe, that are entirely 100% waste heat, zero water, community aspects, and they were first on the district heating piece. Yeah. So it's a very easy fit in if you have the right tech to do it efficiently. And so I think Europe we can learn a lot in that aspect. And quite frankly, one of the things I'd love to see in the US is there's nothing preventing us from doing master planning of industrial assets with the data center assets in cold places like Chicago. It's expensive to heat industrial, million-square-foot buildings. There's more than enough heat in a 100-megawatt data center to do all of that. So why wouldn't you do it? So we're looking to those types of projects to facilitate that.
I think we've got to take some lessons learned from Europe, though, as well, because there's some decisions that have been made across Europe that are counterintuitive to the strategic importance of AI. It's stifled some of the growth that we see in terms of the data center build out, and really created some challenge over there. So it's a lot of what the work that Schneider Electric are doing at the moment is really working with government to try and influence some of what that policy has to look like going forward, making sure that we don't end up in a place where you have unrealistic goals that are put in place that ultimately stops the build out, and that's essentially what we're seeing in some of the geographies at the moment. So we have to take some of those lessons learned and make sure that we are still driving AI as a competitive advantage for the industry rather than as a barrier to growth, which is what it feels like at times.
I imagine, yeah. And by the way, we have regulators, state, federal, everything right in here. I think one of the things we were going to talk about is what are some of the asks we have. So if we look forward, we're rolling at 2.5, so we're going to have to wrap it a little bit. I would love to have each of you share with the audience kind of your closing vision of what you think the largest, most critical imperative is as we look forward as an industry and energy specifically, and how we tackle that. That's number 1. We're going to do 3. Number 2 is, what's one thing you would ask the regulators? You kind of already covered that in the industrial master plan, but in addition to that, what else would you ask for? They're here. And then number 3 is, which PTC is this for you? What PTC?
What was the last one?
Which PTC is this for you? Number, count. How long have you been coming?
All right, I'll start with the easy one.
Yeah.
This is my 6th.
Excellent, thank you.
PTC. With regards to the regulators, my ask, I'll keep it simple, is bring us into the conversation, because we need to make sure we're making decisions that are based on experiences and the right things. So let's not regulate to stifle, let's regulate to make sure that we're serving communities and moving forward. So that's the thing, bring us into the conversation. And then the first question was something we should do to help drive the power.
And what do you think is the single most transformative opportunity for us in the space for energy over the next 3 to 5 years?
I think it's really taking some of these things like SMR, nuclear, natural gas, and a fuel cell, and really putting to the test. Let's get them deployed, let's get them running, let's get the loads, and really let's just get them out there instead of talking about them.
Excellent.
So without getting into the specific product, one of the products that we've launched is a CARB standard meeting baseload and backup unit we call Turbo Cell that will be 3 gigawatts in 27. And the reason why we did that, the product isn't as important as what we think needs to happen from a regulation standpoint is data centers absolutely, especially over a certain size, as we've talked about it, I think there's pretty good uniformity, have to be a grid asset.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? It doesn't just mean demand response, be able to turn on. A grid asset, in my mind, is an active grid asset that's capable of frequency regulation, because be it political, security issues on grids, right? All of the cyber attacks and things like that, or just natural events, solar flares, we're moving into a significantly more grid threats, and you want resources that are able to recover grid frequency, solve surrounding issues. And so that, to me, is, if there's one, holy grail for regulators, it's to get into the specifics of how grid operates and how you control frequency, and make sure that data centers are active participants in that. And in order to do that, there's two things that you want. Ideally, you want to meet CARB standards, which means low emissions, because you don't want these things doing more. If you don't want to take a diesel generator and operate it for a long period of time. You want it, so we're 98% lower emissions than a traditional diesel, running on diesel. And the second thing that you want after you get low emissions is you want the right system topology and technology, so that you can do frequency correction, you can enroll in grid programs. But so I think regulation pushing, because it's totally doable. There's no Schneider can do it. I mean, there's no ABB. We have our own solutions. Everybody has this capability to do it. It's really just regulators saying, well, listen, if you can all do it, why don't we just set the bar higher to make this an asset for the grid?
So get us involved early, get us engaged, create a national standard for an industrial master plan, data centers as a grid asset and everything around that, SMRs as a source. Why don't you bring us home?
So PTC won for me. This is my first time.
One.
So, yes, yeah, it's so great to be here. I think it's really an extension of what you were saying there, Jake, that we have to stop looking at grid and data centers as two separate topics. They're exactly the same. One doesn't happen without the other. So we have to start looking at it as one topic. The technology exists to drive greater efficiency, even greater efficiency than what we have in our data centers today. So liquid cooling is going to save probably 60 to 70% of the energy consumption, and cooling is 40% of the energy consumption in a data center. So you have a huge amount of efficiency to drive there just with technologies that exist today. Deploying AI into our data centers, driving more efficiency in terms of the decision making and the automation of our data centers will help significantly. And then that last point really there is really bringing it all together, because this isn't going to be done, whatever we achieve, whether it's 170 gigawatts deployed by 2030 or 120, it's not going to happen without partnership, without ourselves on this panel working together, without government working together with us as well. So opening up our doors, sharing more in terms of what's happening, sharing the challenges, and building partnership is really going to be critical for delivering the growth and the expectation that everyone has.
What two excellent points to bring us home. Leverage AI for what we do, right? For how we build, how we run, how we operate, and partnerships together, collaborate together. Would you all please join me in thanking this incredible group of panelists for our discussion today? Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the show. Thank you.